This week and into next week, we have a two-part series, a sequel, you might say, with the 16th chapter of Acts. And today we heard the story of Lydia, her conversion, her baptism, and her encounter with Paul on one of his missionary journeys. And next week you'll hear Pastor Mark preach on the converting experience of a jailer who becomes a leading member in the church of Philippi, and so we should hear these two episodes together. At this point in our time in Acts, there has been a tremendous amount of ministry already taking place in the early church. One of the most divisive, contested questions of the early church has literally just been settled in the previous chapter from what Scott read for us today. There was a question out there among the early Jewish church, and it goes like this: does a Gentile, a non-Jew, have to become Jewish first in order to become part of this new movement that we have known as Christianity? Does it have to follow in that sequence? And there were divergent opinions around that. And so Peter and Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, and many of the other apostles are wrestling with this question of who is in the fold of this new thing and who may not be. And so when it comes time to settle this matter, all of the key decision makers are back in Jerusalem together. And we know it as the Jerusalem Council, and James, the brother of Jesus, says this very key line, that we shouldn't make it difficult for Gentiles whose hearts are turning toward God. We shouldn't make it more difficult for them to do that. What he was saying is there doesn't need to be this multi-step process. It could be that Gentiles become followers of Jesus without an intermediary step. And so that is the result of the Jerusalem Council. And up until that point, Paul, after his conversion experience, has been moving about the Mediterranean churches in what we know as Syria these days. He's been teaching and encouraging the faith, and that was his first missionary journey. And when the Jerusalem Council comes to an end, he commits himself to taking this new news that Gentiles can be brought into the fold, and he says, I'm going to go back to the churches and share this word with them and encourage them in their faith. And so that's where our reading picks up today. Paul has set out on his second missionary journey. And I wish that we had a map because the geography is important here. He's moving about the Mediterranean. And you may have heard this odd thing in the reading, that the Spirit of Jesus is telling Paul and his companions, you can speak the gospel here, but not over here. You can enter into this territory, but not into this territory over here. Which is a really curious thing because these days we think that the Spirit of God is leading us to be in ministry in all of creation. But at that time it was, you can go here, but not there. So as Paul and his companions are moving about the Mediterranean, he can't go into Bithynia, into Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. They have to pass through that area, and they never really stop to tell stories of Jesus. And so they end up on the coastline, and Paul's asleep one night, and he has this vision that a man from Macedonia comes to him and beckons him and says, please come over to us, we need your help. Macedonia was basically on the other side of the sea from where Paul and his companions were. Paul, come to this new land, to this new place, a foreign place to you where you have never done ministry before. Come be among us and help us. Paul awakes from this vision. He tells his companions, and they interpret it to mean that they have to set sail to cross the water and to go be in ministry, witnessing to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection in this new place. So that we find out that along their itinerary, they pass by the island of Samothrace. You could visit there next time you're in Greece. And they arrive on the other side of the water, and now they are in Neapolis, a port city. But they don't stay in Neapolis. They go up to Philippi. And I think there is a very purposeful movement for them going to Philippi. Philippi, a leading Roman city of the first district, as we heard it described. sits right along the second most important highway in the Roman Empire. It would be a point halfway between the eastern part of the empire and the western part of the empire. Ideas and religious practice and trade and culture, all of that passing back and forth. And Paul says we need to go be in that place to give witness to what Jesus has done and to tell Jesus' story there. So they go to Philippi, and they are in Roman territory, and there's not a lot of Jewish communities, not a large Jewish constituency as far as we know, and there isn't a Christian church there at this point either. It had been the practice of Paul to go into synagogues among Jewish kinfolk and tell the story of Jesus, to say that Jesus was the Messiah that had been waited for, the Redeemer of Israel. That would have been a not so odd story to tell in a Jewish synagogue. But with no synagogue in Philippi, he goes out to where folks are gathering. Women are down at the riverbank, perhaps in fellowship, perhaps drawing water for their households, and begins to be in conversation. And we don't have the luxury of knowing what Paul said to Lydia and the other women that day, but probably some sense of storytelling about Jesus, maybe his own conversion experience on the Damascus Road. But Lydia listens, and she's receptive to what Paul is saying. But she's receptive for this reason: the Spirit of God has opened her heart. That came first. All of this movement is Spirit-led. It's the Spirit that has opened Lydia's heart to be receptive. And after hearing Paul, she asks for baptism for not only her, but her entire household. For servants, maybe slaves, for other family members, maybe kids. But she is the head of her household, and the whole household is baptized that day. And she says, if you find me as a servant of the Lord Christ, then come and let me extend hospitality to you. Come stay in my home. And she prevailed, which means she demanded it, and they went. How could this story have turned out differently? What if Paul had not been so receptive to the Macedonian vision? What happens if they were not so attentive to this detour in their itinerary of the Spirit leading them into a new place? Paul had mapped out where he wanted to go. He had already done this one time before on his first journey. He was just going to make another loop until the Spirit said, you can't go there, you need to go here. That was an unplanned move for them. What if the Spirit hadn't already opened Lydia's heart to be receptive? The story of Paul's ministry, the story of the church in Philippi, the story of Christianity in Europe could have been far different. Lydia and her household have become known in our history and our tradition as being the first converts in Europe. The move from Asia Minor into Macedonia was a move from Asia to Europe. So much of our history has unfolded from that one movement. A Spirit-led movement that Paul and his companions were attentive to. It leads me to wonder, at this point in our life together, what is our Macedonian vision? Who is calling out to us saying, we need your help? Come be among us. Come be in ministry with us. Come be in relationship with us. And because we've already seen it at work one time before, we know that the Spirit is leading us there. We know that the Spirit is already opening hearts in the places where we might go. And maybe all that is needful for us is to go and tell our stories of transformation in Jesus, because the Spirit has led us to that point. Open hearts, and we just have to go and be present. The Macedonian vision, as we heard it this morning, is a change in geography. as the early church is moving and doing a new thing. Maybe for us it's a point of new geography. It could be. Outside of Williamson County, somewhere else in the mid-state. Maybe. But maybe this time around, it's not a point of geography where we need to be in a new place. The Macedonian invitation is one to be in a new cultural setting, among folks whose religious experience is far different than what we hold collectively. Cultural language, race and economics, all of those things. Maybe it's being in those places, among new people. Maybe that's the heart of our Macedonian invitation. We have a diverse community all around us. Folks who have no experience of the Christian faith, or maybe very poor experiences. Maybe our invitation is to go and say, you know what, you got burned by church that one time and you were so wounded from it. Would you consider trying again? That carries the power of this Macedonian move, to go where the Spirit leads, to be among people who have receptive hearts and are waiting to hear the stories of Jesus doing healing, redemptive, transformative things in our life. Where do we need to go? Where do we need to follow the Spirit's promptings? And what could it look like for us just to be present with folks that the Spirit has opened their hearts and they're receptive? What would it look like to go be present, to tell stories of Jesus? Hold that question. Don't rush to answer it. Just hold it and consider, where are those open places of receptivity among your neighbors and in your family and in this community. And together the Spirit will lead us and guide us and sustain us, and it may be a detour that we never even planned for, but it will be Spirit-led all the same. Let us be faithful in following where God is calling us. Bless you in the name of the Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit who calls us. Amen.